Welcome everyone to the panel discussion on the business track. So this discussion covers off a few topics that we hope would interest all of you. The first one is around mobile MVP, which is this notion of trying to build out a minimum viable product for mobile. And as you know, just even from the past panel discussions we had today, people were talking about how arguably the bar for what you put out in the Play Store with respect to mobile is higher than what it is for web. Now, there's a bit of a push-pull here, because if you're a small company, you're trying to get something out there quickly, and you have only so much resources and runway that you can invest into it. So how do you determine what that MVP is? It's sort of one of the first questions we'll talk about. The second one is sort of lessons learned, both success and failure in the panel, with respect to things that have worked for them or haven't worked, and their thought process around what they learned from it, what the learnings were. And finally, once you're big as a company, right, and you're having to deal with rapid changes in the marketplace or new competitors that emerge, how do you continue to be nimble with respect to how you build apps so that you can stay competitive with all those changes? So I'll quickly introduce the members of the panel. Sitting right here with me is Kavin, who's with BSB with Tiny Mogul, who heads their strategy. And also with me here is Rajan. Rajan has spent a large part of his life with the startup world, gets the startup world, how startups need to work with run, wait, iterate. So he's the startup guy who works with a lot of other startups too to incubate new ideas and mentors them with it. We have Satya from ClearTrip, and Satya heads product at ClearTrip and shares interesting perspectives with respect to the scale at which ClearTrip has, arguably one of the most respected product companies here in India, how they go about building their apps. We have Roy from Sequoia. Roy recently joined Sequoia earlier. Although he is from a VC firm, Roy has a deep technical side. So you can definitely look beyond the suit and shirt there. He worked with Zynga to help Zynga take their Z-Cloud. So he brings different both technology and perspectives from a VC as well, which would be insightful for us. And finally, there's Leena, who led a very successful workshop just a couple of days back, who works with Multiness and is a big proponent of agile as well as continuous integration and heads engineering at Multiness. So with this, right, I'm just going to let this largely be interactive between the panelists. So the first sort of topic is around what is mobile MVP? What is your perspective on it? How do you go about determining that? Maybe I'll start with Rajan. Maybe you should jump in.
Sure. So first, I'll spend a second on, how I think about MVP. There is a misconception that MVP is a minimum set or, reduced feature set of your product. In my mind, MVP is really a learning tool, learning to understand if a particular, business insight that you're thinking exists. You get to build an MVP and test it out. So it's really a learning tool and not really a product, so to say. And anything that you can do, maybe talk to people or, build and show or, get some behavior analysis done, that could constitute an MVP for your product. Specifically talking about how to think about MVP in mobile, I think it depends a little bit on where the idea stage is or, the app that you're thinking about, what stage it is in, and some amount of context. Let me sort of give some examples. For instance, let's say you're building an app which is going to be an add-on to an existing offering. It may be the case that the offering is very well validated in the market. So your choice is really about whether it is a poor cousin or reimagining of experience within the app. So in that particular scenario, MVP is going to be very different. You're going to focus on how are you going to get the new experience out, and it may take longer cycles. And there, you know what your product is. You're just trying to sort of replicate it. But let's say, you're coming up with a new idea, and in that new idea, there could be, multiple cases. In the new idea, there could be categories of apps where, they have been validated in the market. Could be Messenger, could be games, could be specific type of utility applications, where your MVP has to, sort of add on additionally to what your competition already has. And that's the part that you need to build and test further. So that may, constitute a certain release cycle. But if you have a brand new idea, a blue ocean idea, right? In that case, you have to, sort of think of 2 or 3 different phases. One is whole idea validation, whether your idea is going to work or not. Maybe even before that, you have to think of idea extraction. What kind of ideas are you going to work on? And then after that, you have to figure out whatever idea that you're coming up with, whether it can work or not with respect to the end users. And in that case, what I have seen is sometimes indie developers, they just, go ahead and put that, develop that idea into an app and put it onto the app store. One of the things that many of us don't realize is that the app store is not an idea validation platform. It's a platform for distribution, marketing, and customer support. So you may want to validate the idea even before putting into the app store. You could build a paper prototype. You could build a mobile app, a mobile web app, and test it outside the app store, and then go to the app store and test it further. So for now, I'll pause here. We'll get into more discussion of MVP.
I think there's one thing that I agreed with a lot of what you said, but there's one thing I'm not sure I agreed with, which is the whole concept of trying to essentially do something that someone has done before. There's almost never any value in that. So by definition, if you're trying to rebuild something that someone has done, it's because there's some insight that you have that has not been successfully captured in that app. So there's always an experiment, I think, that is possible. I think the big I agree with broadly pretty much everything else you said, but I think from a feature perspective, what I think is interesting is, if you think about the feature set as a sort of 2-dimensional matrix, where you have, all the features on one side and then all the platform experiences on the other. The question is, do you build out a set of X really, really well, and that hopefully captures the idea, or do you, actually build a little bit of everything? Sort of a sense, right? In fact, this is, I think, a good question for Kavin, especially with Hike. It was an interesting sort of what you were trying to do there. So I'd like to sort of understand what you said, what you think. I mean, how did you approach Hike in that sense?
Yeah, I think so. As you rightly pointed out, the idea is that you always have an idea about a problem you want to solve, and the big question is, what's the best application that can help you solve that problem? And to sort of get an idea of whether the problem exists, the MVP is launched. That's the idea. So I do agree with you as well in the sense that there is a massive learning curve you have post the MVP, which is the purpose of the MVP in the first place. And when we launched Hike, actually only on Android and beta back in July. It was simply a one-to-one chatting application, but we still got traction because people were upset about the user experience on other applications. Right? In December, when we launched Hike, we got traction in not in India but in Germany and Middle East because they loved the user experience. So even though we wanted to solve the problem of messaging fragmentation in India because not a lot of people have smartphones, we also realized that people were looking for a much better looking, much better functioning messaging application. So that's the way I see an MVP, which is what's the minimum set of features you can launch, including the one feature that's the atomic unit that you want users to do, and can you figure out whether there's a market based on that MVP and iterate after. Because your first attempt is always going to be the worst attempt. You must understand that. And you must provision for like a 6-month runway after that to sort of build and launch the application to convert it into something that actually goes and solves that problem. One of the learnings we had was, our first version of Hike was very simple. We had one-to-one messaging and we had group chats. We didn't even have file transfer. And so, the way we work is, we're obsessed about user experience. So we said, let's, perfect every detail, but limit the number of details to perfect. So launch, a very small number of features. And that approach worked for us in Hike very well. And when we had the initial traction in user base, we went and sort of built out the Hike to SMS feature, all the sticker stuff we have, and so on and so forth. So that's how we tackle sort of an MVP to sort of BSP, but that's Hike itself. If you look at gaming, on the other hand, it's a whole different ballgame. In gaming, you have to spend, 2-3 months building a very rich, arty game. Maybe not the entire vision set of features you have, but at least the first 5-6 features. We did that with our game called Song Quest and Shiva that are doing fairly well in the app stores. So it really depends on what kind of app you're launching in the app store. The MVPs are very different based on what you're going to launch. And people asked us, hey, listen, why can't you just launch Hike as a web view on mobile? You can't do that because the experience is not the same. And you have to sort of get feedback and get data on the experience you want to build for the next 2 years of your company. That's where I would sort of leave it.
So just a couple of things that I would want to add. So when we launched ClearTrip for mobile about 3 years back, that was like technically a MVP that we launched. So the way I look at MVP is, as we discussed earlier, that's basically it's a tool to validate your hypothesis. So this is what you thought before building a product, whether that will actually work in the market or not. And there are a couple of things that we look at for validating the MVP. So let's say you've managed to launch an MVP. So how do you measure whether the MVP is working for you or not? So there are two parameters that we look at it. One is the critical factor for the success, and the other one is the success. So let's say when we launched ClearTrip for mobile for flights. So we launched a very basic mobile site to begin with, wherein user can just book one-way flights for himself. That's it, nothing else, no fancy stuff. And we polished it like hell, so that the experience is not bad. The thing that we wanted to validate was, one, is there a need for such product at that point of time? Are people comfortable? So whether they want to use flight search on mobile. And the critical factor was, are people willing to make payment on web, on mobile at that point of time or not? So, so those are the things that we wanted to measure. So let's say if there are people coming on the website, but let's say for some reason of the infrastructure or their apprehension, they're not able to make payment. So that's one of the critical factor for the success of that product. So if let's say they're not able to make payment, there's no point making that app or the product at that point of time. And let's say if there are people making payment, but the number is less, but there are a lot of people using your product, which means the traction is there. So the proof of concept is solved. There are some apprehension because of which they are not making payment. Probably that you can overcome with other ways. So I think those are the two ways that we have to look at to measure actually after launching the MVP.
That's interesting. So before you did the sort of one-way trip, you clearly had enough data that that's actually, there's a broad number of searches in that, just in that space, right?
So yeah, so we were seeing a lot of traffic coming from mobile browsers for our desktop site. So we knew that people want, like they're searching for mobile flights, like searching for flights on mobile platform. So we had some kind of some data points there, but we were not sure whether they're ready to book the entire transaction on mobile site.
Yeah, because I think that's the critical part of the MVP. We've seen people do MVPs and then they actually can't tell what the data says. Like, was it a bad idea? Was it a bad implementation? You want to be able to at least say, this is exactly what I was trying to prove.
Yeah. So, so you have to, before you launch, or let's say once you've decided the MVP, you have to have a set parameters for the success or failure of that MVP. Right. So if that happens, I'll take it as a success. If that happens, I'll take it as a failure. So I think that is also equally important, except apart from making an MVP.
Did you guys do experimentation? Do you have an experimentation engine built into your app? Or
for an AB, you saying?
Yeah.
At that point of time, we didn't do the AB because that was, we were just trying to verify whether that basic hypothesis of people making transaction on mobile at that point of time is true or not. And we were more than happy to see the number of transactions we got on day 0 of our launch on mobile site was more than the number of transactions we got on the day 0 of our desktop site.
Okay.
So
qualitative measures is what
you yeah.
So this is interesting. You have one person who went deep and one person who went broad. And they both seem to have had successful MVPs. So maybe we can't resolve that today, but it's kind of interesting. Is there a preference? Do you guys have a preference for broad versus deep? I mean, just in your specific case, you had a very good reason for doing a broad slice. But
what we were actually evaluating was whether that. So I think that varies from product to product, as Kevin mentioned. So let's say if you're trying out a product, a competing product which is competing with 4 products already there, then you can't launch a very shallow MVP. Then it has to have some USP. So basically, then that USP becomes your MVP. So that let's say there are 5 products already available and you want to launch a 6th product in the market. So whatever features that those 5 products have are like your baseline, and then the USP with which that product you're launching becomes your MVP. So then you have to validate that whether that USP that you're trying to push is that a USP or not. So that becomes, the base becomes slightly bigger.
The one rather obvious hack for I think MVPs is not using up your brand name upfront. Right? Like you and I had that argument. I remember when we were doing that thing, and it's I'm surprised more people don't just do that. Which is like it's hard for you to ship a ClearTrip mobile that's not at your level of standard, right? Because you have a customer base you've trained to expect a high quality bar from you. Yeah. Do you just test by calling it something else, except for Make My Trip?
No, we've not tried that as yet. A couple of reasons, because the kind of products that we deal into, it's slightly riskier to launch a white label MVP, because people, unless they have a trust with the brand, you'll not book a flight or a hotel with a white label product that you don't know. So that will fail the entire purpose of MVP. So you may launch a white label, you say that you think that people are not transacting, but it may be not because of the product, it's because your brand is missing. So we just have to add the brand and people will start transacting.
Brand will work in favor of you.
It'll work in favor of us. So.
In a big company, there might be questions of brand, whether you want to take a risk with the brand. But if you're an indie developer, even there, you could go ahead and say, do I want to accumulate enough negative ratings, if I don't do a good product. There again, you can have the option of, sort of putting out, if you're doing idea validation, right, you could use a pseudonym and then, sort of try it out there. My belief is that, if you're trying to do idea validation, do it outside of App Store as much as possible.
Right?
I mean, the problem that becomes, it's very hard to acquire the first 10,000 users if you're doing it off the App Store. And that becomes very tricky.
Sure, but is 10,000 users the right hypothesis to sort of validate?
First X number, and I think it really depends on what you're targeting. Let's say a ClearTrip, they must have been targeting number of transactions per broad consumer base. Sure. If 10,000 people came in and the limit was 5 transactions, and you had 1 transaction, it's not a good sign.
Sure. See, in case of ClearTrip, they had an offering and they were trying to do mobile on top of it. Sure. But like you mentioned about a game. Right, a game is like a blue sky idea, I would call. Right, it could be any kind of game. Some game might have traction, some might not. It may resonate, it may not. So there, maybe 10,000 is a good hypothesis to go with.
So I think when I say 10,000, I think it's whatever number suits your business best.
Right.
And so with gaming, we look at a number about 25,000 users, and we look at the retention numbers. If it's still not where we want it to be, we'll make some tweaks to the game and then push it out further. And we keep doing that until we get to a point where the retention is good. After which we can pump some money behind the game. Sort of blast it. So, and I think in gaming, it becomes a lot easier to sort of launch in a different name. I think a lot of companies do this in the US. They launch games in Canada first under a different name, and bring it back to the US.
Plus, I think that there's another approach that people use is instead of launching in your main market, they open the app in the pseudo market. So whichever market is closer to your main market, instead of launching it there, they launch it in the other market, which is very closer to your demographic. They get the learning there, fix the app, and then launch it on the main market.
MVP is again a learning tool. I mean, you just want to be confident that you can invest more money to sort of do it. Correct.
I think one interesting point is how we build MVPs on web versus mobile. There's such a big fundamental difference how you build for these platforms. And I'd love to get some views, I guess, starting from you, on how you've been tackling that.
So the only major difference between building MVP for mobile and for web is the amount of polishing that is required for mobile products. Because once your app, so what happens is that web, when people usually interact, so for us it's the case with web as well. So we can't even launch a basic product on web, but it's more for mobile. So whenever we're launching something, it has to be fully functional, fully integrated. It has to talk to the existing app. So the amount of effort that goes into building an MVP for mobile is slightly more. So what we do is that we kind of try to test the hypothesis on web if it's a new idea altogether. So we try to, because the iteration is faster there. So we try to validate the idea on web and see if overall it's working. Then we bring it to mobile and then we do the next level of iteration there. So on a broad level, we try to validate it on web.
I think it becomes very hard for a mobile-only company to do that. And that's one of the challenges we face, at VSP, at Hike, and Tiny Mugo, which is we have some A/B testing, experimental stuff going on, but there's no framework to allow you to do that. And unless you're a big company that can invest a lot of time and money into this, it becomes very tricky for one sort of small company to do that. And I think that's why that 1 month cycle.
But there are so many tools coming out now for A/B testing.
But they're very lightweight. They're like change the copy, change the color. It's very hard for you to move pixels around in a very sort of dynamic way unless
But
you sort
other
of...
approach I've heard is that you load the teams from the server instead of actually pushing out multiple stuff. But I don't know. I'm not.
So to give you an example,
And
so
also
I'll
the
give you an example.
experience.
So we launched Stickers and Hike back in June sometime. And it was part of the emoticon set in the application. And one day we just said, what are we doing? Let's pull the sticker button out. We just took it out. And our sticker traffic went up 10x in 1 month. So those kind of things you can't do on the fly. On the web, you can change pixels around, change code, and so on and so forth.
It's not
That's the
as
biggest problem.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think also one of the biggest issues is that you come back to that old 1 month development cycle, which is not great for any of us.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one big hurdle in mobile today.
So a lot of such experiments or feedback we do outside the app store. So we don't ship it to all the users. We have kind of a closed set of users whom we ship private betas and we take feedback. So I think that's one of the approaches.
And nowadays, even
we can
Android allows
beta rollouts.
beta rollouts and alpha rollouts.
Phase rollouts. Yeah.
Post phase rollouts
And
too.
any experience with stuff like touch flight or something?
So
For
testing
on the shorter.
So test flight we use for internal circulation of the apps, especially. So like whenever we are evaluating any feature or something. So there is a group of users who is connected to test flight. So we ship the build to them using test flight. We take feedback. We incorporate that. So let's say there are 2-3 versions that we are evaluating, 2-3 ways of doing the same thing we are evaluating. We send 2-3 like different builds to those guys, and we take feedback and then we incorporate them.
This is to an extent somewhat like A/B testing. I mean.
Somewhat to a close.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
The problem with test flight on iOS is that you can only get 100 people to use your app.
Yeah,
It's
that's
horrible.
Yeah.
And I think Apple's really failed there in a big way. With Google, you have a private Google group you can start off and have beta testing. It's fantastic. Now, most things you can cut and paste and copy paste and work across multiple platforms. But at the same time, navigation on iOS is very different to Android and Windows. So how do you test those out? So you have to have a lot of I guess your intuition has to be good, and the first 50 users who use the application have to be sort of satisfied with what you're doing, which we call like hallway testing in the company. We just go to people and say, what do you think? And you got to keep doing that very, very often to sort of test your hypotheses and assumptions.
You probably have to identify a sample set of users with whom you can interact more often, because doing A/B testing on a scale is also not feasible. So because what happens, we discussed that on the first session, because a bad rating is like a tattoo on your app. So once you get a bad rating, there's no way to get out of it. So we usually try to keep it outside the app store as much as possible, unless it's something that is unavoidable.
So that's interesting. So one of the approaches we took is we launched a referral scheme in the app sometime back.
I have a question. So it seems
Will
like
you opening it up to the audience?
Let's do
I
it.
think
Let's
you
do
guys-
it.
you guys need to involve the audience.
This can override anything.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I think you need to involve the audience, because I bet there are a lot of people with a lot of questions. Now, one thing that seems very interesting in all this is that on mobile, you have a lot of options for how to limit your testing. You can limit by geography, you can limit to a test group, and so forth. On the web, you don't have those options. You need to make them yourself. Now, Satya, this question for you. Do you still think that you would rather do this on the web than the mobile? Because you seem to indicate that you would rather not be constrained by what happens when a test fails on mobile. Like bad ratings, for instance.
So the reason we used web was because it was more iterative. So let's say whatever feedback that we got, we could easily incorporate it, and we could iterate it faster. So that's why we used web initially.
Chase, I'd like to go back to the earlier point that I made. See, the difference between an app store and any other thing is that app store is a distribution platform, a marketing platform, and a customer support platform. And there is no precedence to that before. When you used to build desktop applications, you could use a certain channel and see product is not working, you could withdraw. But here, once it is out there in the market, there is no way you could, get back from the bad tattoo that you have got. So it becomes very, very tricky, even though it has a certain benefit of, segmenting versus through geography. But, if you're trying to test out a certain marketing campaign, you'll get dinged on the customer support if you've not really. So you can't treat really as an experimentation platform. It has to be a full polished. So, the suggested way is, do many of these things outside the app store as much as possible, so that you can get those marketing ratings or customer support ratings.
So it sounds like you have a lot of options, but it's dangerous to use them.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of options available outside the App Store. So App Store, like what I feel, it should be
it's a lot of work if you do it outside the App Store. It's all your effort now.
Sorry, I didn't.
It's your effort at segmentation, your effort at passing it on to someone to target and so forth.
But it's worth the effort.
Yeah. Or you take it off brand, right? I think the primary sort of.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not clear trip, he has a good reason for not doing it. But if you're not clear trip, then just take it off brand.
I think for smaller developers as well, it becomes very hard off the App Store because they don't have that small budget to acquire the first X number of users, to get that feedback. But one of the things we're learning more and more about Android is that, if you get to a certain point in the App Store, you can, reply back to customer reviews.
Yeah.
And we feel that it's a very strong thing because when you launch something and it's slightly broken, you can reach out very quickly and turn that 1-star to a 5-star. So it's kind of become as close to web as possible versus the other App Stores. And so we use the Android platform to experiment a lot more than the iPhone and Windows platforms in our sort of user base.
See, many people use Google AdSense to do MVP, and they sort of create a facade as if it is a real product. In that case, it is possible for you to just only drive directed traffic. But here in mobile, what happens is translating that 1-star to 5-star might take very long, and Satya, you have examples about that. So it is more risky for you to still treat it as a experimentation platform. Google, I agree, is much better than iOS. The risk still remains.
There's definitely a risk.
While he's making his point, I'll just ask if we line up the next 2 audience questions, if you don't mind. Go ahead.
So one thing, I think at the end of the day, if you're, what other choice do you have? That's the big question. Let's take Tiny Mughal and Hike for example. There's not much other choice. So one of the things we did in our games for Songos and Shiva was that we built some experiments in the application, but we had to hardcode those experiments. So we only had a couple of things we can do in the back end to switch sort of levers. But if we had a whole brand new idea, you had to ship out a new update, which the conversion rate is not the highest. Luckily for us, we're getting to a point where Android and iOS 7 have Aura updates, so you can be much more aggressive with updates. And I think by the mid of next year, we'll have a system where the App Store will get a lot closer to how the web functions, with auto updates, with more A/B testing frameworks, and so on and so forth. I think it's a matter of time before it sort of just gets cleared up.
But a lot of this discussion is still primarily around product and not so much on the engineering side. I think the other interesting problem with the MVP approach is, there are 2 things that happen. One, the MVP fails, and then that's actually from an engineering perspective a better outcome. It's when the MVP succeeds and now suddenly product is like, oh, okay, we've got 2 more weeks and everything seems to be working, and now we're going to ship this and get 1 million users, but you've had to make trade-offs to get to that point. I think that's another interesting thing just to get a perspective on, which is now you have a lot of technical debt you have to pay down sort of super quickly. And how do you guys deal with that?
Great topic, and I think you guys are enjoying this. I'll let Leena make a point, but meanwhile, just if you have the next 2 questions lined up from the audience. Audience questions, just raise your hand and the guys will get to make
Even
a
in a
point.
dev conference, the engineering part is not discussed. Terrible.
Yeah, go ahead, Leena.
Yeah, I think the answer is simple. Keep your debt low. When you are building your MVP itself, keep the best practices in mind, like separation of concerns, those kind of things. If you keep it low, do enough for the MVP. Right? Keep what you want to experiment on. There is no. The reality is that there is no hard and fast rule saying that okay, this is how you should do it. I mean, only thing is follow the best practices, and then follow practices like TDD, which keeps you to the focus, and write enough code to make the MVC out there. Don't over engineer. Don't add lot of architecture choices that you don't need at the time of MVP. Keep it evolving. Keep it emergent. I think.
The only job in which I haven't heard the phrase you're over engineering this is actually at Sequoia. But I think it's actually super hard, right? I think he made a good point earlier about the fact that you can't let the app be the first time you actually get MVP feedback. You should really be doing it much before, because the reality of technical choices is that those are hard to make and those take time to make, right? There's no, especially in a very application distribution scenario where crashes are 1-star ratings and things like that, you really have to I mean, you really have to go. You have to spend a lot more time in engineering on, I think, mobile than web. I don't think there's an answer on that right now.
See, if it's a brand new idea, then
I think
you're.
I'll just have to close for questions. I'm sorry. It's a great discussion. I know we're super engaged.
I was going to just say, if it's a brand new idea, just throw away the code.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree
Throw
with
in the
that.
code, but it's still
So
2
we
weeks
did.
to ship the new one.
Throw away
So
MVPs. Audience questions? Please go ahead. Go to the mic.
are you pro
Hi.
anti-engineering? That's the first.
So, slightly tangential question, but outsource or insource a core part of your building a mobile app? Design, engineering, what are your views? When is the right time to do so? When is the wrong time to do so? Move fast or build a team slowly?
I think for MVP, it's okay to outsource. But once you start getting traction and your MVP results are positive, so that depends upon also depends upon the core competency. So let's say if the app is your core competency, that's the product that you're taking to the market, you can't outsource that in a long term. So you can't depend, like you can't ship your core competency through a third party. For MVP, I think it's a good idea to outsource it just to test an idea, do some stuff. But once it's there, you want to go into the market whole hog, I would suggest you to do it in-house.
So I take the opposite approach actually. So one of the learnings we had was we actually gave a couple of teams outside BSP to build Hike, and it was a complete disaster. And I think one of the things we realized was that when you insource all this stuff, when you end up breaking your application, when you have millions of users, there's a lot of learning you can sort of bank on internally, and that helps a lot. It's a big deal. So I would say insource plus the experience you can build with the team that's working with you is much better from day one. So that's what I would say.
Go ahead.
I would like to add one thing I'm coming from the consulting background, so I think as the MVP, the term is short. It doesn't make sense to outsource, because if you are building, if from the consulting point of view, also I think the effort that you have to make the building a team, and then it should be for longer term. So once you get the traction, I think then it makes sense to outsource and keep the team going.
I don't know. So I think I'll just
Never outsource. Never. You must stop it now.
No, I'll just clarify. So what I meant was that the reason I meant was that let's say you're trying out an MVP, you're a startup guy, one-man company. So it doesn't make sense to hire one guy as an Android developer, one guy as an Android iOS developer, and then try it out some model that doesn't work. So just for trying it out a model, it's okay. But like if you're into like serious business, it has to be in-house.
I still don't agree. I still think
I
that
agree.
I've actually worked with consulting teams on both sides. I worked in a consulting org, and I used to, give work to consulting orgs. And I've never been able to come up with an incentive design that worked. So for that reason and that reason only, I don't think it works. I don't think you can outsource because you can't get incentives to align, especially when you're trying to move fast. So
I think an idea is best built by a small team of passionate guys. And if you have those co-founders with you who are technical, not technical, whatever it might be, that's the best way to start. And like I said again, you lose a lot of learning the first 6 months if you outsource everything, because you need that when shit hits the ceiling, you need all that learning in the last 6 months to a year. So I agree with Roy.
Yeah, I want to add some color. I agree with both Kavin and Roy here. Sorry, Satya.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
An app, trying to build an app is like trying to build a new product. And any good product startup teams, they need a combination of hacker, designer, and a visionary, a product manager. If it is an individual developer, he plays all this role. And in the initial stages, there is a lot of learning that is needed, and they need to be assimilated. If you're going to outsource it to someone, capturing that learning is going to just be very difficult. And only when you become a very big company, then core competency come into play. Only when you identify what your core competency based on your product or your idea is, then you can figure out what are the competencies that you can outsource.
But there is a small challenge with that. So
Again, in the interest of time, we'll just have to take your questions, and we'll be in the business space later for more questions.
Sure.
Just one last question. So hopefully that's the answer, not uncommon knowledge. Any other questions?
I think it was clear.
Any other questions? Please pass the mic.
Hi, I'm Vincent. As you said, it's not good for putting apps in App Store.
Can you speak into the mic?
Can't hear it.
as you said, hearing me?
Yeah.
Yeah, as you said, it's not good to put the app in App Store as an experiment product. Okay, in an experiment product, there may be crashes, or users may not be displayed. The data will not be displayed. Okay, how we gonna track these things? Are we going to use Google Analytics, or is there any? Yeah, is there any SDK, or is there any framework to track these kinds of things?
Are you speaking about analytics in particular?
Did you get me?
Are you talking about data? How do you track data? Or?
Yeah, tracking the data for an user. There may be crashes in the app as we send to users. So how we gonna track this data?
Specifically about crashes in products.
Crashes or only not the crashes. Sometimes it will be GPS tracking app.
Oh.
So there will be lots of cases. So how we gonna track these network
It depends. I think it depends on what you're trying to do. But in a very simple way, I think if you just want to track analytics around installs and things, there's a bunch of products. I'm going to plug a portfolio company, there's App Annie. But if you want to specifically have the app call Ho, then to a large degree you have to design that in the app yourself, right? So if you wanted to sort of send location back, you're going to have to build an API and a server side to sort of receive that data. Right? So it depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, a lot of the stuff there is existing tools for lots of different things, but specifically if you want an app to say I was started in this location at this time, you're going to have to capture that data and then send it back to your own server.
I think we
Can we
might
talk
have a
about
minute for
engineering
our
now?
last question.
No engineering? You're not going to talk about engineering? This is terrible.
I think we'll quiz you right offline right after on that. I think we might have a minute for a last question if anyone has any. No? That's it? Good. I think we're good. It's 3 o'clock. So right after all the speakers who have been a part of the business track will be in the business space right outside. So those of you who would like to interact one-on-one with them or have any other specific questions, please come by and feel free to catch up with them. They're here. Don't feel intimidated by this. Like Roy is saying, he's happy to dive into all the technical details with you. So feel free to grab their Android phones too, flash them, do whatever you'd like to. So just please just give a hand. I think this has been a very engaging, insightful discussion. Thank you guys. And we sort of ran a little short on time. I think you guys were right into the meat of it and enjoying it, but I think it's been a great